Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, from wherever you may be joining us in the world. We thank you for joining us today as we discuss our annual Human Rights Outlook. My name is Donna Westerman. I'm the Senior Advisor for Verisk Maplecroft, and I'll be moderating the webinar today from New York. I'll give a brief introduction to Verisk Maplecroft and provide a little bit of housekeeping for everyone, and then I'll hand things over to my colleagues. For those of you who may not know us, Verisk Maplecroft is a leading research firm and consultancy specializing in global risk data and country risk analytics. And here at Maplecroft, we believe in simplifying the complexities of managing human rights. We know there is no one-size-that-fits-all approach to addressing these pertinent human rights risks and issues, and we know that many companies, including our clients, are struggling as to even where to begin or what actions are most pertinent in their organizations and value chains when tackling these very material issues. By combining our world-class data with expert analysis and advice, we equipped our clients with the insight you need to make more effective and efficient decisions and target your resources where they're most needed and where you can make the greatest impact. Our specialist consultants and human rights experts will offer you the highest level of assurance. They work side by side with you to understand your challenges across the entire due diligence cycle, from policy and assessment through to training and reporting and developing industry-leading solutions. So whether you're taking the first step in identifying your human rights risk exposure or leading the way in your field, we are here to help you deliver your strategic goals and make the greatest impact. Now, let's just get on to a few housekeeping items I need to go through with you. Firstly, your microphone is muted by default for the duration of the webinar. However, you can use the chat panel to send us questions because we always want to hear your questions. You can do that at any time during the presentation. If you are viewing the webinar in full screen mode, you can see the chat function via the drop-down panel that is revealed when your mouse is at the top of your screen. Otherwise, it can be opened in the top right of your WebEx window just by clicking on the blue dialog button. Please note that if you would like to ask questions anonymously, you must just have the host and presenter selected in that drop-down box of recipients before sending your question. Otherwise, the other participants will see the question and who it's from. Secondly, we will try to answer as many questions as possible with the remaining time at the end of the presentation. We have a very big turnout today, so we will get to as many questions as possible. But if we run out of time and we don't get to your question, we will coordinate a follow-up response with you after the session. And finally, please don't worry about needing to take down copious amounts of notes during the webinar. Because you've participated in the webinar today, the presentation slides and a recording of the webinar will be made available to you via the email you've provided in the next few days. But just to note that due to the GDPR regulation, if you have selected Do Not Email on any previous Maplecroft forms, unfortunately, we will not be able to send you the slides of today's presentation. Not to worry, you can change your settings or you can just get in touch with us directly at info@Maplecroft if you would like to receive this. So that's the head of the housekeeping, everyone. And now I'm delighted to be able to introduce today's panelist. We have Will Nichols. He's head of environment and climate change, and he's based in our New York office. And we have Victoria Gama. She's our senior rights analyst, and she's based in Buenos Aires. So Victoria, I'll start with you. Human rights issues are growing ever more complex and diverse and have an increasingly prominent profile in the media. Can you tell us a bit more about the Human Rights Outlook and how you came up with the topics for 2019?
Of course, Donna. First, let me thank the audience for joining us today to discuss some of these relevant topics. For this year's HRO, we've drawn from the expertise of our colleagues across the business. In addition to our in-house human rights specialists, we've also included expert analysis from our colleagues from the environment, commodities, regional, and analytics team. We've found that our cross-thematic approach has allowed us to look at current as well as emerging issues on human rights through a wider lens, while at the same time providing certain nuance and specialized expertise on topics that often overlap across several themes. When deciding which topics we wanted to tackle, we've identified two key themes that we believe needed to be addressed in this year's Outlook. The first is looking at fast-moving developments in technology and examining what these means for companies that have to grapple around with human rights issues that may not have encountered before. This became the basis for our focus on the freedom of expression and data privacy piece, as well as our renewables piece. Secondly, we wanted to look at the drivers of risk in current and emerging human rights developments. Hence, our look into climate change, supply chain risks in the Xinjiang region in China, and issues surrounding social license to operate in Latin America. Aside from relying on our expert analysis, our methodology also draws on consultation with external stakeholders, with companies across multiple sectors, and crucially, on our trusted human rights dataset scores.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. Really exciting HRO this year. Clearly, it's much more multidisciplined and cross-sector, which I think is just fantastic and really reaches out to, such a wider audience. Definitely a lot to unpack here, so let's just dive right into it. We all know human rights issues are growing ever more complex and more intertwined with other themes such as energy supply for the increased demands of a growing population, and certainly growing concerns over climate change and how it can be linked to migrants under conditions akin to modern slavery. So I'd like to turn this one on to Will. Can you tell us a bit more about this piece on climate change driving modern slavery?
Of course, Donna. Yeah, and hi to everyone listening. Thanks for taking the time to join us. So we should probably start by saying that a feature of the last decade is that businesses and investors are increasingly required to monitor human rights risks and address climate change impacts on their operations and their supply chains as part of sustainability efforts. And that trend has been driven by legislation, but also by shareholder and consumer requirements. And in response, we've seen a lot of glossy corporate publications that detail what companies are doing. But what we don't see a lot of is a recognition of the relationship between human rights and environmental factors like climate change, how they influence each other, and how companies can look to address both these issues at the same time rather than put them in silos. So we set out to explore the nexus between climate change and human rights issues and examine that relationship.
Clearly, Will, a complex issue. Can you tell us a bit more in detail which regions are most at risk from climate change impacts?
Absolutely. So what you see here is a map of our climate change vulnerability index. And this is a composite of the physical risks of climate change, so things like high temperatures, more storms, droughts, and so on, as well as how sensitive a country's economy is to those risks and how well it is able to adapt to them. So all the red areas here are extreme risk. You can see these hotspots in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Central and South America. So these are the countries that are going to face substantial physical threats that they're not able to deal with. So things like shifting weather patterns and scarcer water sources. Clearly, both of those issues will have a significant impact on agriculture, which is a staple of the economy in an awful lot of these red areas. So what we see then are so-called second-order climate impacts that affect wider society and economy. So these include things like climate-driven migration. Now, we expect a lot of migration related to climate change will be internal to countries, perhaps moving from rural areas to cities where there's more economic opportunity, but at the same time increasing crowding and putting more strain on urban resources. So seeing that, we think that many others will look at these sort of low-risk green areas in Europe and North America and think, these are a better bet for their families and their future. And, it's important to be clear that this isn't a new phenomenon. The role of climatic changes in the Arab Spring, in Syria, violence around Lake Chad, it's all fairly well documented. And, as we were putting this slide back together, we had Hurricane Dorian devastating the Bahamas. And anyone who's seen the pictures of the damage there, it's truly heartrending, but it's also an example of the kind of impacts we will see more of. And it's easy to understand why people will look to move from areas like the Caribbean that are being affected by those kind of events more frequently, as that level of damage becomes more and more frequent. And to illustrate that, in the first half of 2019, 7 million people have been displaced by weather events, which is almost double that from conflict and violence. At the end of this year, severe weather will see an estimated 22 million displaced, making it one of the worst years in history. And looking forward, impacts like Dorian are expected to create more than 140 million climate migrants by 2050. So that's basically twice the UK population on the move, or 2 out of every 5 people in the US. That is going to be an overwhelming amount of people for agencies to deal with. I mean, you look at the UK, it declared a migration crisis after some 300 people crossed the channel in boats. So people are not properly prepared for the magnitude of this. And sadly, we know that where there are a lot of desperate people on the move, and where authorities are struggling to cope, there are always people trying to exploit the situation. And this is where threats of modern slavery, trafficking, forced labour really come in.
And what are the consequences for companies and countries where a lot of people listening today, are actually sitting in the US and in Europe, for example?
Sure. So I guess there are 2 sets of issues that we've looked to address in this research. The first is that violations are going to rise along migration routes where vulnerable migrants are increasingly at risk of being subject to exploitation before even reaching the so-called safer countries. And as you can see on this slide, we've mapped our Climate Change Vulnerability Index, which is the map we showed at the beginning, against our Modern Slavery Index. So countries on the migration route to the southern border of the US, like Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, these are ranked extreme or high risk for both climate change and modern slavery. And you can see that because they're grouped towards the bottom left of the graph. We have 0 as extreme risk and 10 as low risk. If you look at Mexico, for example, it's less threatened by climate change, but still at high risk for modern slavery. And what this suggests is that people in these countries will increasingly start to move, and that when they do, likely towards North America, the US and Canada, they run the risk of gang violence, trafficking, forced labour, and of course, violence and political instability, which can be affected by climate change, are other drivers for migration we can mention in these countries. So keeping people in these countries while the US waits to process applications, as the Trump White House is proposing, is only going to raise human rights risks for these people, because as we can see, these countries are high risk for these kind of risks. I guess what's interesting is the second point. You'll notice on the graphic that the safer countries in North America, the US and Canada, where migrants in Latin America typically move to, these are rated as being less at risk of modern slavery and climate change. But even here, migrants often enter informal at-risk sectors like agriculture, where human rights violations and trafficking are sadly a reality. This is especially the case in states like Texas or California. So it's important to remember that arriving in North America does not mean that migrants are safe from exploitation.
Thank you, Will. When you see this particular slide and you see the plotting, it really is, quite telling. But let's just flip to, Europe for a second. What is the picture like there?
Sure. So Europe is similar, but there are some key differences, I guess. So if you look at the transit countries in North Africa and the Middle East, by and large, they're less threatened by climate change than Central American nations, and also less at risk from modern slavery, with Libya being a notable exception. But looking beyond the sort of immediate entry points, the picture is quite interesting. I mean, we flagged Sub-Saharan Africa earlier on when we showed the Climate Change Vulnerability Index map, and that region is, as it shows, an absolute climate impact hotspot. Out of the top 10 countries with the most internally displaced people due to climate disasters, so flooding, drought, storms, 7 of those countries, including Nigeria, DR Congo, and Ethiopia, are African nations rated as extreme risk in our Climate Change Vulnerability Index. And one big reason for that is, as we flagged earlier, that some 80% of farmland in the region is managed by smallholders who just simply don't have the capacity to combat extreme weather changes that are coming. And looking back to Europe, we know that currently around 1 in 5 illegal entries into Europe are people from sub-Saharan African nations. And to be honest, that's likely to be an underestimate given countries of origin, always recorded. But studies suggest that by 2050, we may see as many as 1 million people a year set to travel from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe. I mean, that's an incredible amount. And, as we've mentioned, increased flows of migrants will only raise the risk of modern slavery, other human rights violations, both in transit and for those who cross into Europe. So, as we mentioned in the US, there are high-profile cases in Europe too that demonstrate that the risks of exploitation in informal sectors are really more widespread than we think. I mean, especially if you look at places like the agriculture industry in Italy and in Spain.
Clearly a huge issue everywhere in the world, Will. It certainly cannot be isolated. It's a real trickle-down effect into so many, facets just of life. Obviously, this is going to affect companies and suppliers globally. What sectors are most at risk, and are there steps that those businesses can take to make sure they're addressing climate change and modern slavery?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great question, Donna. It's such a key challenge. And, even before we get into that, we haven't really mentioned Asia, where there's a real threat from climate change affecting particularly Southeast Asia and people moving there. I guess if we look at sectors, I mean, we expect modern slavery affects all sectors really, but looking at our industry risk data, which highlights risk for particular industries, sort of food and beverage, agriculture and seafood, construction, manufacturing, and transport industries are probably most exposed to modern slavery. So companies in these sectors face a perfect storm, I guess, of rising interest from investors, NGOs, and consumers in their social climate policies, alongside the global expansion of modern slavery rules that we've seen, and of course, mandatory reporting legislation. So there are probably a couple of ways companies can look to tackle this, either addressing problems in the supply chain or sort of on the ground improving conditions so people can see a good way forward where they are. One is on the operational side, so managing on multiple fronts is always tricky, but as we all know, the first rule of addressing problems is to make sure that outcomes are being measured. So businesses need to make sure their policies, their strategies, KPIs, codes of conduct, even training programs are all aligned with this challenge of addressing environmental and social issues together. And we can also talk about strategies like mapping supply operations to determine which are in climate-sensitive areas, which might be more exposed to modern slavery, or I guess things like setting up an auditing system for people for those operations located in the highest risk areas. But I guess ultimately this is one of those problems that's kind of too large for any one company to address, which I guess sort of takes us on to the second direction. So working within and even across sectors is going to be vital to make an impact. And this would involve collaborating with industry peers, NGOs, governments, to share good practice and for businesses to have the opportunity to participate in on-the-ground projects. And I suppose there's also something around the public statements companies can make. So it's not hard to envisage that large migration flows are likely to raise anti-migrant sentiment. We could easily see a hardening of political rhetoric, which again could lead to stripping of labour rights, voting rights, and so on. We've seen a lot of companies come out against climate denial in the last couple of years, and speaking out against anti-immigration sentiment could easily go hand in hand. I mean, the populist view is always to kind of cut overseas aid and climate funding, but companies with supply chains and operations in these countries they're really well placed to highlight how supporting the development communities and improving climate resilience is actually one of the most effective methods of limiting migration.
Thank you, Will. Clearly, this issue is a great opportunity, as you had mentioned, for collaboration, and also the importance, of data and how to prioritize, next steps. The old, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done. So between, great data, between also the compliance requirements that companies have, quite a disruption, in supply chains right now. And as you had, rightly mentioned, cross-sector for sure. So thanks again. So now I'd like to turn to our second topic, where Victoria has been looking at the renewable energy sector and the potential for links with human rights issues. Victoria, just to kick us off with some background here, can you provide us with some context around how you came to look at this sector?
Thanks, Donna. Yes, I'm happy to do that. So in the renewables energy sector, we've got an industry that is viewed as inherently sustainable. Its very goal is to reduce or to produce, in a way, cleaner energy to reduce emissions and the associated contributions to climate change. So basically, the question is, what could be more responsible than that, right? And while it often gets bad press around some of the environmental impacts associated with these forms of energy generation, we tend to hear much less about the human rights impacts. Some minor exceptions, such as the use of child labor in the extraction of cobalt for lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles, for instance, but that's kind of on the side and not across the board, let's say. But just because human rights impacts aren't currently front and center, this doesn't mean that these challenges aren't present for renewables. And they can pose a real threat to its socially responsible credentials if they are not handled correctly. We've already seen this with electric vehicles and how exposure to human rights can throw an industry under the spotlight, resulting in reputational damage that could threaten funding, of course, for a specific project. Evidence of the inability of the renewable energy industry to address human rights concerns is proven by an industry report from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, where they've shown that almost half of the renewables companies they surveyed did not have any human rights policies in place. So we have a sector set to expand massively by about a terawatt of generating capacity in the next 4 or 5 years. Just for reference, this represents 10 billion 100-watt light bulbs lighted at the same time. So an example of how the sector is expanding is that there has been more renewable energy installed capacity in the last 4 years than any fossil fuel and nuclear capacity combined. So despite the so-called green flavor to renewables, the sector hasn't necessarily got to grips with the fact that human rights issues could become an equally scalable concern for the sector as it continues to grow. To delve deeper into this, we've used our data sets to examine two aspects of the sector where risk could be present. Firstly, within the supply chains for renewable energy generation, and secondly, with respect to the implementation and operation of its infrastructure.
Thanks, Victoria. It's great about the Business and Human Rights Resource Center piece. It certainly provides a great baseline for the energy sector to look at their current strategy and how they need to move forward in impacting human rights. So I know you looked at solar panel production. Solar panels are a very big thing here in the U.S., both from corporations and all kinds of rebates going back to corporations that use solar panel production, and also even from a consumer lens. So let's look at risks here. What areas of risk have you identified?
Sure. So we've identified two main areas of concern. With respect to the manufacturing stage, hazardous chemicals used in the production of the panels have been linked with worker safety incidents in China, which is by far the world's largest producer of solar panels. This fact alone would be enough to suggest enhanced supply chain due diligence for those sourcing panels from China. But this prompted us to look at our occupational health and safety index scores for some other countries with significant levels of solar panel production, and we've noticed that a number of these places score poorly for these issues as well. Now, it's difficult, of course, to find direct evidence of violations in solar panel factories outside of China, possibly because there just aren't high profile enough to be reported. But the fact that these locations exhibit difficulties in maintaining safety standards should be a signpost for increased vigilance for anyone sourcing solar panels looking to achieve responsible supply chains. The second area we looked at related to the extraction of quartz, which is the raw material from which polysilicon for photovoltaic cells is produced, and in particular with purity quartz, which is the best material for PV panel production, but is comparatively rare. As many people know, going this far up the supply chain to try and trace raw inputs is difficult in and of itself. It's worth noting that in China, for instance, the supply chain is associated with this material or many other materials isn't always that transparent. So with demand for panels and therefore high purity quartz rising, we've got exploration for new sustainable deposits taking place around the world. And this includes some locations where data tells us that labor standards are poorly enforced, such as Mauritania and Saudi Arabia, just to name a few. Now, as we know, mining is an inherently hazardous industry, and quartz mining in particular is associated with a series of lung diseases called, for instance, scoliosis. So we have the potential for future solar PV supply chains to involve high purity quartz mined in under-regulated locations, which opens up the potential for further labor rights to emerge in upstream portions for the value chain.
So all in all, it sounds like solar is definitely part of the renewable sector with a huge application potential in some really key parts of the world, but where there's definitely the latent potential for human rights risks to increase in tandem with installed capacity. And you also looked at supply chain risks for biofuels as well. Can you tell us what you found there?
Of course. So continuing our theme of examining supply chain risks, we use our commodity risk data sets to look at the production of the raw materials for biofuels feedstocks in a selection of countries. Just by way of background, our commodity risk data sets provide scores for 20 ESG risk issues that are specific to the cultivation of a soft commodity in the country in question. To produce the column chart that we're showing here, we averaged the risk scores for each country commodity combination from the data set across 9 issues. And these are migrant labor, discrimination, forced labor, working hours, wages, human trafficking, occupational health and safety, freedom of association and collective bargaining, and child labor. And in the chart, we're displaying a number of producing locations from our data sets that came out as especially risky. In particular, the farming of sugarcane and oil palms in a number of countries was identified as highly risky when it comes to labor standards. I know we don't have time to run through a breakdown of all the issues here, but just as an example, there is evidence of child labor in sugarcane production in India, Thailand, and Brazil, not to mention on oil palm plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia. While it's often other sectors making use of these crops that bear the brunt of criticism over sustainability issues, mostly focusing on environmental impacts such as deforestation, the presence of labor rights violations in this part of the value chain fundamentally exposes all dependent supply chains to association with these issues. And again, as demand for biofuel increases and feedstock sources potentially also diversify, the scope for these problems to be linked to the industry will also increase.
Thanks, Victoria. You certainly mentioned an awful lot of red flags for corporations to consider in the area of human rights. This is a good look at where there are potential for pitfalls to emerge for the sector for sure. If labor rights issues in renewable supply chains increases as the sector expands, which it looks like based on your research, it certainly will, and these become high profile, the pressure to address these will be significant. Investors funding projects through green bonds or impact investing schemes or institutions with codes of conduct will want to know that the supply chains associated with these projects are sustainable, or at a minimum that there's a solid due diligence strategy in place. So this is definitely one of the industries that should be keeping a close eye on this. Lastly, you looked at a third renewable energy source, wind energy, which is also, an up-and-coming, very hot area for corporations. And that's not without its problems. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course, and you're absolutely right, Donna. We looked specifically at the wider societal impacts of wind farms globally, and we found that in several countries where expansion of the sector is expected in the next decade or so, the occurrence of land right violations is the main driver of community opposition against such projects. Wind farms are particularly land intensive, often taking on land that has long been occupied by indigenous groups. For instance, Mexico is a prime example of how wind farms have been contentious. Wind farms in the state of Oaxaca, for instance, they had at least 28 farm mega projects, and during the construction of some of them, there was forced displacement of communities that were not adequately consulted following certain FPIC standards. This tends to result in local indigenous communities opposing being displaced from their lands, and generally this escalates in excessive use of force, either by private or public security forces that these companies tend to hire, which of course has immediate and direct reputational risk with, of course, wind energy companies and their investors. In the figure we have over there, we've looked at the risk levels of three issues that are pertinent to wind farm projects in 7 countries where wind energy is expected to take off in the next decade. 5 of these countries, in the looks of China, India, Brazil, Mexico, and Turkey, are assessed as either high or extreme risk in our indices, covering indigenous people's rights, land rights violations by security forces. Other than the obvious reputational impacts these issues will have on operators and investors, there are also operational, legal, and financial impacts to consider. Coordinated and sustained community resistance has proven to result in significant financial costs, lawsuits, and even cancellations of very expensive projects. And at the heart of wind energy projects that have successfully managed to secure a social license to operate is an understanding of how to respect and protect the land rights of indigenous and local communities, and of course consult them significantly. We've seen that renewable energy projects that empower local communities present lower reputational and operational risk to investors.
Thank you, Victoria. Certainly a lot of information to process between the links of climate change and modern slavery, and how even in an effort to act against climate change, renewable energies can be overlooking their own challenges in the human rights arena. The slides were great too. They really told a very strong story. All right, team, we have a few minutes now to turn to some of the questions that have come in. So Will, this one's for you. When looking at the steps that companies can take to address modern slavery and climate change in their supply chains, what on-the-ground projects can business get involved in? Can you give us a few examples?
Sure, of course, and that's a really interesting question. I guess a lot of what companies are looking to do is to improve conditions on the ground through climate resilience or improve the human rights situation, so that people in at-risk countries have more options and better prospects, as we mentioned. And there are obviously several different types of projects that businesses can get involved in, or simply invest in at the local level. So I guess some examples could be investing in local infrastructure like schools to sort of boost education and reduce risks of child labour, or improvements to green buildings, whether for companies' own offices, which would obviously go some way towards reducing carbon footprints as well, but also other buildings in the community. And I guess if you're looking at other human rights risks, businesses can ensure that their workers are safe from occupational health and safety issues. This could mean investing more in mechanised systems and training as well to prevent accidents and increase efficiency, or even just ensuring that employees can get to work and back safely through safe transportation measures. So I guess there's also, you can also look at things that would help community development. So in terms of reducing water usage, reducing waste, which kind of cuts the risk of having a negative impact on the environment and decreases the risk of polluting the local environment, depriving communities from water sources, which can obviously go some way to harming social license to operate.
Thank you, Will. I see a few other questions have come in that are a build off of that question. So for those of you that have submitted, we'll answer those privately through email. But Victoria, you're not off the hook. There are a few questions here that are actually the same, so let me just go in for that one. So the question is, looking at the inevitability of energy transition, how can companies best manage any social risk they could be exposed in to the production of clean energy?
Thanks, Donna. That's an important question. We all know by now that since we've already highlighted this in the presentation, the transition to renewable energy is unstoppable. The issue here is really how do we make sure that this transition is fair and sustainable. I think that at the center of this, renewable energy companies must engage in meaningful human rights due diligence and adopt policies that reflect this. Most importantly, this has to include consultation with all appropriate stakeholders, including obtaining free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous populations, and if needed, popular consultations with local communities. The UN guiding principles in business and human rights are a good starting point to base your human rights due diligence framework on. Aside from due diligence, companies should also monitor the implementations of policies and procedures. For example, If the salient risk identified has to do with the harm against the community that could have been inflicted by security forces guarding renewable energy operations, then what you have to do is closely examine what the issue was, how to remediate in a way, and prevent this from happening again. It's essential that in this scenario, companies identify, again, prevention mechanisms to avoid the identified risk, and also establish grievance mechanisms that are accessible to local communities and even to your own staff for actual impacts derived from this specific projects to be sort of less impactful in a way. I think that at base, a coherent due diligence plan is a good starting point, and then acting on this identified risk will be the next step. It's also an ongoing process instead of something you do once and you don't have to think of again. A good strategy to have it is to incorporate human rights policies into day-to-day operations instead of treating due diligence as a tick box sort of exercise. The other thing to note that is, as mentioned earlier, social risks aren't just about protecting a company's reputation. Financial, operation, and litigation risks are real, and as we discussed, have a sizable impact.
Thanks so much, Victoria. I cannot believe we've used up all our time and we've come to the end of today's session. There is still several questions we didn't address, but we'll follow up with all attendees with a copy of the Human Rights Outlook and a recording of this webinar. And please also note that the panelists are available for discussions post-webinar. And just to note, we will be presenting on these same topics tomorrow on an accommodating time for our colleagues in Asia. So if you'd like to share this information, you can redirect them to the news and events section of our website at www.maplecroft.com. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to Will and Victoria for today's discussion and preparing the great slides. And thank you to everyone who's joined in from wherever you have been seated in the world and join us for our session. Have a great rest of day and evening.